we've been talking about regarding the life of Joseph and his ability to interpret dreams. Hopefully today, if it seemed a little abstract to you, it'll all kind of come together. It'll cohere in a way that's very satisfying. And honestly, the more I study this story, we're only going to really scratch the surface of it. But if you really understand this story and the dynamics at play, pretty much everything in your life is going to make sense, right? This pattern is so incredible and important that pretty much everything in your life will make sense. And also, everything that's happening, even in modern politics, believe it or not, is contained within this story. So let's read the first couple verses, and hopefully these points will become a little bit more clear to you. So Genesis 41, verse 1 says this, "Then it came to pass at the end of the full 2 years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine-looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke. He slept and dreamed a second time. And suddenly 7 heads of grain came up out of one stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day, when Pharaoh was angry with me and with his servants, and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker. We each had a dream in one night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now, there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. And he restored me to my office, and he hanged him. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. And he shaved his head and changed his clothing. He shaved and changed his clothing and came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I have heard it said that you can understand a dream and interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying to him, It is not me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. So the rest of the story, it's a bit of a lengthy chapter, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. But the rest of the story, as I said, is fairly well known. Joseph correctly interprets the vision of the cows and the heads of grain, and he says these 2 dreams are actually one. And they foretell 7 coming years of great prosperity, followed by 7 years of extreme famine. And the famine is going to be so bad that it will devour all the prosperity and surplus that we gained during the years of plenty. And if we don't make a serious change to our economy, it will actually end up destroying our nation and the world as a whole. So then Joseph not only predicts this, but he gives a solution to this problem. He says, if we put basically a very heavy tax on all the grain that comes in the next 7 years, we'll be prepared for the famine that will take place afterwards. And we'll be able to weather the storm, and we'll be able to make it to the other side. Pharaoh, hearing this answer and being pleased by it, he appoints Joseph over Egypt. He basically makes him the Pharaoh. And Joseph initiates his plan, and at the end of the chapter, Joseph is married, he has 2 kids. We'll talk much more about them when we talk about his reconciliation with his family. But he has 2 children, Ephraim and Manasseh, and his plan is being implemented, and it begins to save the world from the famine. But as I said, this story is a lot more than just a cause of celebration, which is how a lot of Christians tend to read it nowadays. In other words, they read it as a means of praising or glorifying God's movement within history, but they miss some of the key or bigger points that the story is trying to teach us. And oftentimes this happens to us when we're reading the Bible. We become so enamored by the miraculous elements of the story that we miss the more important spiritual elements of the story. In fact, oftentimes, God will hide an eternal spiritual truth within the supernatural and temporal movements of the world. So, to use an example of this to show you how this works, when the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness without food, God provided them with manna in the desert, literally grain that came down from heaven. And although this miracle was unique and one of a kind, I wouldn't recommend to anybody that they go wander in the wilderness and expect bread from heaven. However, an eternal spiritual truth is contained in that miracle that is for all time, for people like you and me, even today, thousands of years after the event. Deuteronomy 8 verse 2 puts it this way, "And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So he humbled you, allowed you to hunger, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord." So although the manna was only for the people of Israel in the wilderness at that specific time in history, the lesson that man does not live by bread alone, that it takes more than material prosperity to satisfy your life and to satisfy your soul, that lesson is for all time. And in the same way, this particular dream that Pharaoh has and the particular 7 years of prosperity and 7 years of famine that Egypt experienced, that's a unique moment in history, but the lesson contained within it is for all time, and it's for all people, including you and me. So let's dive a little deep, and let's figure out what's contained in this really obscure story. This story is actually, for me, it's the one that I remember most distinctly from my childhood. I remember my parents telling me the story, and the imagery of like these really thin zombie cows eating up the fat cows like freaked me out, and I was like, that's bizarre. And it's meant to disturb you, right? The story is meant to disturb you because it is describing a disturbing series of events. Really, if you want to put this in a nutshell, what this story is about is how systems devour themselves and how to avoid coming storms, because they're always going to come. And when I'm talking about systems, the system could be as large as a global economy, it could be as large as a nation, or it could be as small as a family, or even as small as an individual soul. But this works at every level, and as I said, as we describe it, hopefully this will become less abstract and more clear for all of us today. But let's start on some of the more miraculous elements that gets people hung up. And what I'm going to try to do in this section right here is just show you that not much has changed. So when we read this story, we're like, oh, how archaic. They actually planned their national policy based on the dream of some world leader and the interpretation thereof, and then they appointed to a point of power the person who could interpret it. How archaic, how backwards. Thank God that we don't think that way anymore. Actually, we totally do, and I'll explain that to you hopefully more clearly. So back in the day, the language that ancient man used is very different than the language that we use today, but they mean the exact same thing. What ancient man realized is that we're not just bodies, but we are body and soul. And there's a lot of things to you and me and to reality, the reality that we live in, that we don't fully understand. And because we don't fully understand it, we need symbols to help us orient ourselves in the reality that we are in. Now, in modern day, we don't use language like that, but we say the exact same thing. So what psychologists started to do is they came up with this term called the unconscious. But the unconscious is exactly the same thing as the ancient word for the soul. They are things that you are aware of, but you can't readily describe them to other people. Instead, you experience them through symbols and through instinct and intuition, but you don't experience them directly. Let me give you an example. So there are so many things, there are so many mechanisms that happen within your body. Your body is such a complicated system that you could literally spend a decade of your life studying to understand your body and still be vastly ignorant of all of its inner workings and all the things that might go wrong with it. Right? That's why we send people to college for years and years and years to try to understand the human body, and at the end of it, they understand a little bit, right? They understand kind of a tiny bit of what the body is like. Because we don't understand it, we have to function or behave or respond to symbols that we don't fully understand. So while I couldn't tell you exactly what happens to my body when it gets sick, I have become wise enough to recognize the symbols of sickness. So I'd be like, oh, I got a stuffy nose, I'm coughing, I'm hacking, like I feel tired, I'm lethargic, things like that. Those are all symbols of sickness. They're symptoms. They're not actual descriptions of what sickness I have or what exactly is happening in my body, but they are symbols that I've come to understand and I've become acquainted with. Right? The same thing happens with our cars. Right? We drive our cars, and even though we don't really understand the internal combustion engine and exactly what it does, we understand it well enough to operate it, and we even understand it well enough to understand the symbols. We could look at, those of you guys who don't know this, the vernacular of the little dashboard lights you guys have. You know what they're called? Idiot lights, right? So they're for idiots like you and me, who don't fully understand what the car is trying to tell us, but the little light is like, oh, that looks bad. Like that little symbol looks kind of bad. I don't know exactly what it means, but it looks bad. I'm going to take it into the mechanic, right? Those are examples of how we operate using symbols. Now, the place where you most experience the symbolic is your dreams. You have these dreams that you don't fully understand, and you wake up and you tell someone like, hey man, I had this crazy dream about you last night, and you try to explain to them what's going on, but the more you talk about it, the more you're like, I kind of sound like a crazy person. It's because your dream is not a direct one-to-one understanding of reality. It's your reality encoded in symbol. Just like the dashboard lights, just like the symptoms of a sickness, you don't understand your reality fully, and so you have to understand it primarily through these symbols. Proverbs 20, verse 24 says this, a man's steps are of the Lord. How then can a man understand his own way? As I said, these things happen at great societal levels, but they also happen down at the individual level. There are many things that you and I do that we are not fully conscious of. That's why it's such an infuriating question when you were a kid and your parents are like, why did you do that? And you're like, I don't know, actually. I don't know. Well, you sit and you figure it out. And it's like, well, I could sit for hours and I'll still not be able to tell you why I did this particular thing. Right? We don't understand our own way. We don't understand why we do the things that we do. We've only learned how to operate off of symbols. We know how we feel, but we can't really express directly what those feelings are like, or why they move us in the directions that they do. We are a little bit out of touch with our own reality. And even though many people write off dreams and the unconscious, the soul, how many people will claim that they've had experiences with things like deja vu, instances that they almost had a premonition of, they saw it and then it happened, or vivid dreams that literally took place in the future later? Even stone-cold atheists will admit that they've had experiences with deja vu and with premonition. Now, I'm not saying that every dream is prophetic, and neither did ancient man believe that. But what I am saying is that your dreams are telling you an awfully lot that you don't fully understand. They are spiritual realities that are represented through physical symbols. So how do we understand a reality? If we don't have this direct understanding of reality, how do we operate? Well, what we do is we hire a class of people that Socrates called them shadow casters. If you want to know more about that analogy in the Republic, I could talk to you about it later. But Socrates called these people shadow casters. Today we call them experts. Back then they called them magicians. But it's the same exact thing. So Pharaoh has this dream. He doesn't know what it means, and what does he do? Verse 8. So Pharaoh awoke indeed, and it was a dream. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. You have a symptom. You don't know what it means, right? You see a symbol on your dashboard. You don't know what it means. Who do you call? An expert. You find a mechanic or a doctor, and you explain to them the symbol. You're like, this is the symbol that I'm experiencing. What does it mean? And you pay the expert a lot of money because they could hopefully give you a meaningful interpretation. This is what it means, and this is the solution to your problem. This is the thing that you're aware of, but you don't understand. I understand it, that's why you're paying me the big bucks, and here is a prescription to fix your problem. So again, we think we're advanced, but not really. We really do function just the way that the old people did We just call it something different. Even people who mock the story, they're like, what, they put someone in power just because he can interpret dreams? What do you think politicians are? What's Martin Luther King's most famous speech? I have a dream. We respond to people's dreams. They tell us, this is my vision for the future. You could use the word vision if you want. The word dream works equally well, though. I have a dream for what this country could be. This is how I'm going to implement it. This is my strategy. And if enough people resonate with the dream, if enough people are like, yeah, I have the same dream, you win and you get all the power. The person who can best interpret the symbols of their society is the one who rules the world. I hate to tell you that, but that's just how your world works. What do you think movies are? Someone has a dream, they have a representation of reality as told through symbols. They put it in a film, and if enough people recognize it as something that they've experienced, they pay money to see the movie. This is why, Christians who complain about the arts are like, oh, the arts are becoming more debauched and more sinful and things like that. Arts have always been debauched. I hate to tell you this, but if you look historically, arts have kind of always been debauched, but arts are a representation of the imagination of the culture that they live in. In other words, if someone creates an artistic work that is heavily sensual and debauched in its origin, and they create it in a civil society, a moral society, you know what will happen to that person? They'll be kicked out of society. No one will see their movie. If millions of people go to see debauched stuff, that's not the artist's fault. That's our fault. They're just expressing our imagination in a way that we find coherent. I could get more into that, but I won't. That is exactly what's happening in Joseph's day. So we use different language, but it is the same exact thing. Okay, so how then do we understand the dream that Pharaoh has? So it's like I said, it's reality, but it's reality told through symbols. And that's exactly what Joseph tells the Pharaoh. He says, you have this reality that God has shown you, but he's shown it to you via these symbols. Why does God do that? I'll give you two quick reasons, and then I'll explain exactly what the symbols here mean. The first reason is because God is expressing a reality that is beyond our human understanding. As I said, it's the unconscious. We're smart enough to understand that it's a problem, but we're not smart enough to understand what to do about it. So God has to use symbols in order to convey divine reality to us. In Matthew 13, when Jesus gives the interpretation of the parable of the sower and the seed, he tells his disciples, it was given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. He's saying the reality that God's trying to communicate to you is too big, it's too vast to understand directly, so I have to use symbols to cater to your weakness, right? But as you begin to study the symbols, reality begins to make more sense, right? Reality begins to make more sense to you. The second reason is God is showing himself to be supreme. He's not just the one who observes reality. God is the one who creates reality. He's the one that is over reality. And so he lets people in to the fabric of his tapestry, right? The plan or the pattern of his tapestry every now and then, but he does it to let us know I'm in control. You think you're in control, but really I'm in control of your life. And that helps us to understand why Egypt was destined to fail, right? So let's look at these symbols, and they'll hopefully make a little bit of sense. Really what's going on is, like I said, it's a failure of the elites in Egypt to appropriately interpret the signs of the time, okay? So Egypt has this class of people, this expert class of people, but it should strike you as weird that none of them could even venture a guess at what these symbols might mean. Isn't that odd to you? Right? Even like a child would be like, it sounds like something bad's about to happen, right? Like even a kid would be like, it sounds like there's a calamity illumined there, Pharaoh, but they don't even venture a guess. You're like, how could you not know enough to just guess, to at least not seem like a moron and say like, I think something bad's about to happen, right? But none of them even try. Now, the reason why none of them try is going to be very clear once we understand the symbols contained here. The reason why none of them try is because they lived in a society of unparalleled prosperity. And when you live in a society of unparalleled prosperity, the one sign that you will not be able to interpret anymore is a sign of collapse. This is what happens to elites when they become a part of a system of luxury. And this is the failure of the elites. It's because they weren't able to understand that, guess what? The gravy train eventually comes to a stop. You might want to prepare for calamity because it's always coming at a certain point. But instead, they wanted to live in their excess and their luxury, so they had failed to understand the signs of collapse. They had failed to be able to interpret the signs of collapse. What saves Egypt, though, is at least they had the humility to admit that they didn't have the ability to interpret these symbols. If they would have been arrogant enough to try to interpret their own symbols, they would have actually created calamity for their nation, which does happen later on in Egypt's history, and we'll talk about that later. Okay? Now Joseph, right, this is not coming out of nowhere, right? We can't read this story disconnected from Joseph's life. Joseph has already seen this corruption occur at every level of Egyptian society. Joseph was purchased by a wealthy politician named Potiphar from slave traders, the Ishmaelites, who kidnapped him from his native land. And Joseph was not shy about divulging that information. When a society is corrupt enough to purchase enslaved and kidnapped people, there's a problem with the elites. Second, Joseph was accused of a crime he didn't commit, and on the word of one corrupt elite, he is sentenced to prison without trial. While in prison, he shows himself faithful, but nobody re-examines his case. Then, 2 people are thrown in jail with him for the vague crime of upsetting their Lord. Wouldn't that be interesting that you could just be thrown in prison for that? You upset me. You upset me, you're going to prison. That's the society that they're living in, a society where you could just be thrown in prison without trial just because you made me mad. And based on how one prisoner is executed and the other is released, it's heavily insinuated that it was an arbitrary reason. The reason why the baker is executed and the cupbearer is released is very, very arbitrary. And in fact, even in that release and execution, there's another symbol of corruption at the top. Why does the Pharaoh kill the baker, but he doesn't kill the cupbearer? This will help you understand a very weird verse in the book of Revelation. In the book of Revelation, a famine is predicted, and it's depicted in a symbol, and the symbol is a black horse, and its rider is carrying scales, right, like to weigh things. And as he's running about causing famine in the earth, a weird sentence is spoken. We're not really told who's saying it. But a weird sentence is told, and it says that the inflation is going to be so high that grain is going to cost basically a day's wages, right? Just basic grain is going to cost a day's wages for the average person. But it says, harm not the oil and the wine. This is what we're talking about. An elite class that is so spoiled on their luxury that they are unwilling to give up even the barest symbols of their excess, even though the rest of the world is starving to death. The baker represents the bread maker of the society, the one who provides for the needs of the palace. The cupbearer only had one job, well, 2 technically, to fill the cup of Pharaoh with luxury, to fill it with wine, and also to taste it a little bit to make sure it's not poisoned. But beyond that, that's really all he did. So Pharaoh pardoning the cupbearer but executing the baker shows the excess of the elite class in Egypt. They were unwilling to suffer even the tiniest inconvenience, but they were more than willing to give that inconvenience to everybody around them. They were people who were unwilling to sacrifice for the coming flood, for the coming famine. They were corrupt to the uttermost. And that's what we're seeing in this symbol. Okay? So the fat cows that are being eaten up by the lean cows. Let me break down a couple things here. Number 1, the cows come out of the Nile River. That's significant. The Nile River, most of you guys know, right? It's in Egypt, and it's this very steady, dependable water source in the country. Now, to us today, that doesn't mean a whole lot. Back in the day, when people had to grow their own food, having a dependable fresh water source was insanely important. In years of drought, they were able to create irrigation canals that attached the Nile to the average farmer's crop. Thus, they were insulated from drought. This allowed Egypt to become the first superpower in the Middle East. Next, he sees grains coming up. Grain was an interesting, you could even call it a technology. Because what grains like corn and wheat did is they were things that were easy to mass produce, and you can preserve them very simply. It's not like raising cattle or something like that. Grain is something that you can mass produce and you could store it up. You could build silos and store it up for future time. Therefore, they had these two technologies, these two abilities in their nation that allowed them to become immune to drought and famine. This is the pattern that happens in every society. We develop a mode of prosperity that makes any amount of famine seem illogical. We're like, this will never come to an end. This will always pay dividends. I'll give you a couple examples so you can see this. Let's talk the auto industry in the 1920s in America. Right, so the auto industry in the 1920s in America created the Roaring '20s. Right? And all these people started living these excessive lives. If you want to know more about how excessive they were living, read The Great Gatsby. Right? In The Great Gatsby, you see these elites, and they're just unbelievably decadent in their lifestyles. They're vacationing to Europe every other week. They're buying lavish homes, giant cars, holding these incredibly debauched parties on a daily basis. And they're spending all this money like it will never run out. Like there will never come a time where this comes to an end. But guess what? It did. It was called the Great Depression. You may have heard of it. But when things started to run out, do you think that the elites repented and they're like, oh, we were wrong. We're sorry, guys. Let's live a little bit less excessively. Let's shore up the stock market. Let's make sure that people don't lose their money. No, they doubled down on their indulgence and created what should have been a small catastrophe became a global catastrophe because of the arrogance of the elites. I'll give a second one. How about the housing market crash in 2008? So all these bankers realized, like, we could create these mortgage bonds out of these mortgages that people have. And it's so safe and it's so dependable that we could give a mortgage to anybody, right? We could just sell it to anybody and we could have adjustable rate mortgages and it's going to be great and the gravy train is never going to come to an end. But guess what? It did. How about the tech bubble bursting in the early 2000s? Or how about what's going on in politics right now? We have this, over $30 trillion worth of debt? And people are like, touch not the oil and wine, man. Like, I know we got this inflation problem. I know we got this out of control spending. But do we really want to like touch some of these entitlement programs? I mean, is that really the best idea? You have the elites telling us like, it'll always be good, man. I know that we're like trillions and trillions of dollars in debt, but we're never going to have to pay for that. Someone else is going to have to pay for that. Yeah, your kids are going to have to pay for that. And they're going to have to pay heavy. The longer you let a system go like this, the more catastrophic the fallout will be. That's what the symbol becomes. A debauched system that is self-cannibalistic. It's the same symbol, if you want to look at this up on your own time, Ouroboros. You could type that in, O-U-R something, Ouroboros. But anyway, so it's a symbol of a snake eating its own tail. You've probably seen it before. Most moderns think that that's a symbol for eternity, but it's not. It's a debauched organism that consumes even itself. That's what it is. It's this exact same symbol that Pharaoh's seeing. Okay? It's a snake that tries to be everything, and by becoming everything, it devours itself. It's like the dumb snake game, right? I'm dating myself a little. When cell phones first came out, they didn't have a lot of things on them, but they had this awesome game called Snake. And it's like you had this little snake that you're like moving around the screen, and if it eats its own tail, you lose, right? I guess enough elites did not play that game because they don't understand this problem. Because it's a big problem. And I'll give a modern example that, again, will hopefully make this a little bit more clear. Disney. Right? Disney was this, it still is, it's this insanely successful business, right? This insanely successful corporation, to the point that no one thought that Disney could bleed. when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, everyone thought that Disney was invincible. It gobbled up like everything. It gobbled up CNN and ESPN and all these different entertainment conglomerates. They had all this IP that they stored up over the decades. And everyone's like, Disney's untouchable. But as they started to bleed a little bit, they started to lose their way. And you could make arguments as to why they started to lose their way. But what has their solution been to their problem? They cannibalize their own IP. They go back to their own IP, their own intellectual property, like Snow White, that they just made a movie about, like these other sequels that they're doing, like the MCU, right? They go back to their older content and they're like, we'll just repackage it and ship that out and everyone's going to love it. That's a snake eating its own tail. What it's done is it's not only made people hate the movie that comes out, but it even makes them not really like the original that it's based on. You're cannibalizing yourself. You're destroying yourself. You're feeding on your own prosperity, thinking that it will never come to an end. But it will. Let's take a smaller example. Okay? Let's say you have a family, and the kids are starting to get to teenage years. And the parents are not liking the fact that the kids don't want to spend a lot of time with them. And they have that nostalgia. They're like, oh, I remember the time where my little one was just right there on my knee, and they thought I was amazing, and everything was great, and we were hanging out. And I don't like the fact that that prosperity is coming to an end. So what will they do? They cannibalize their own memories. They're like, let's go on the same trip that we did when you were 2. And we're going to recreate it, and you're going to have just as much fun as when you were 2 years old. And they go on the trip, and the kid's like, this is stupid. I hate every second of this, and I kind of hate you too. And the parent's like, why didn't this work? It's because you're cannibalizing your own tail. When the system starts to fail, it's time to try something new. But if you don't learn that lesson, you go back to the beginning, and you won't understand why it's not working. We do the same thing for ourselves. Right, you get a little older, right? I'm starting to get a little older. I know I don't look it, but I'm like pushing 60, right? And so you start to get a little older, and you realize like, man, the workouts that I used to do and the diets that I used to do, they're not working out. I'm gaining weight, even though I'm doing the same thing. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to repeat the same workout program that I did into my 20s, and I'll be in the best shape of my life until you throw out your back, and then you realize that you're not in your 20s anymore. You can't cannibalize your own luxury. If you do it, you're going to die. Like literally you're going to die. That's what Joseph is seeing. He's seeing we're in a system that doesn't know how to deal well with luxury. They're living in excess, and they're living in debauchery and decadence, and because of that, when the famine comes, it will destroy us. Okay? Philippians 4 verse 12. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. And the most famous quote in the entire Bible that's always disconnected from this verse, I could do all things through Christ who strengthens me. It's a very weird verse, isn't it? Learning how to be abased, that makes sense. You're like, okay, I have to learn how to be in need. I get that. Learning how to abound, though? Learning how to live in prosperity? Yeah. If you do not learn how to save up the blessings of the current moment, you will become accustomed to luxury and you will not understand how to deal with lack anymore. Human beings, we're amazing. We're incredibly well designed by God. We can adjust to basically anything. Right? You could adjust to need very quickly, but guess what? You can adjust to prosperity very quickly too. I always joke with my wife, because she's from Minnesota. You know, in Minnesota, it obviously gets like below 0 and stuff like that. But in the winters in Tucson, she's like always freezing cold. Even like right now, probably in this room, she's probably cold. I don't know. But like, it's like, how did you live through those seasons in Minnesota? Because humans are masters at adaptation. When you go to a new climate, your body adapts to the new normal to the point where it can't remember the resilience it built up earlier. So if you were to go back, you would freeze to death, right? It wouldn't work anymore. Again, that's a snake eating its own tail. In the same way, even if you grew up poor, once you get accustomed to luxury, it's very hard to give it up, isn't it? Once you get, like, when you're young and you have to scrape by and you have to, like, really skimp on things and you can't go out to eat and you have to save pennies and pick up dollar bills off the side of the road and things like that, and you learn how to live in that need, and you're like, I'm never going to forget these lessons, and then guess what? You become more well-to-do, and you freaking do. You forget the lessons, and you become foolish with your money, and you don't save anymore because you think, again, the gravy train will never run out. I'm in this new season of life. I'll always live in this excess. I'm never going to have to skimp again. And then guess what happens? Things turn. The economy turns around. Housing markets go down. The inflation rate goes up. And you realize, I can no longer live in the way that I used to. And if you don't adjust to your new normal, you will spend all of your excess until you're drowning in debt. And you're not going to be able to live anymore. This is another way, by the way, to understand, say, like the Tower of Babel, as well as the number 666 in the book of Revelation. So let me go through both these symbols, because they're the same symbol, right? All these symbols are the same in the Bible. The Tower of Babel, it's an artificial tower that unites heaven to earth, but it's an attempt to make everything solidified, right? It's never going to change. Remember what the people say when they're building the Tower of Babel? We'll build this tower, we'll make a name for ourselves, and we'll never be dispersed abroad. We're going to build a tower that's so magnificent and glorious that we're never going to experience want or wandering ever again. But then the language is confused. We're not going to get into that symbol right now. 666 works the same way. The mark of the beast in the book of Revelation. 6 is the number of man, because it's the day that man was created in the 7 days of creation. And it's repeated 3 times, which is a certain type of coherence or completion. Think the Trinity for a second, or even the tripartite soul of man, body, mind, and soul, right? These numbers actually have a great deal of meaning. What it is it's man trying to become everything. It's man trying to create a system that will never fail, that will always succeed, that will always prosper. And it has a demonic bend to it. But people who take the symbol upon themselves, it's people who are what? Buying and selling. They're entering into the system believing that the system is everything. It replaces the need for the divine. It replaces the need for want and intimacy. And the wealthy in a system have a great disadvantage. Matthew 19, verse 23 says this. Jesus said to his disciples, "Assuredly I say to you, it is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And again I say to you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." What Jesus is saying, right, because Jesus is doing exactly what Joseph did, though his message was rejected and Joseph's was accepted, and we'll talk about that in 1 second. What Jesus is saying is exactly what Joseph is getting at as well. When you're wealthy within a system, you never want the system to change. Jesus comes and he tells the Pharisees, he tells the wealthy in the system, you are doing something that is going to collapse in on itself. You need to totally change up what you're doing. You need to adopt a completely new system, right? Nicodemus, one of the leaders, he's like, what do I need to do to be saved? And he's like, you got to be born again, man. Your system is so flawed that you have to start from zero, right? I can't just add something to you. I can't make some small adjustments here. We need to completely and radically change the entire thing. Otherwise, it's going to destroy you. And Jesus is saying the wealthy in a system never want to see it end. And because they never want to see it end, they cling to it. And by clinging to it, they guarantee their own destruction. This is unfortunately what happens to the Pharisees, and we'll talk more about them in a second. But it's not what happens to Egypt. The Egyptian elite hear the voice of reason. And by hearing the voice of reason, they avoid catastrophe. And that's what Joseph represents, the voice from the outside. Right? The voice from the outside is something that we see in a bunch of movies. It's in Westerns, right? It's the Lone Ranger who comes into the town and cleans up the dirtiness of it, right? It's in the movie Dune, which was fairly good with Timothée Chalamet. It's in Die Hard, right? It's the outsider. It's the person who comes from outside the system and gives wisdom to the system. He helps them save it through his different perspective. The reason why this pattern exists in all these movies is because it's the pattern of Christ. Jesus is the ultimate outsider. He's the one that comes in and he says, every system of man is destined to fail. Doesn't mean it can't succeed for a time, but every system of man is destined to fail. He looks at the Pharisees and he says, you think that your system can bring you to God? I'm here to tell you that you can't reach God. The Tower of Babel will never work. You'll never be able to reach God in your system. You will only create a system that devours itself. You have to listen to me. You have to go in this new direction. But people don't want to listen to the voice from the outside, and so instead of heeding the voice of counsel, they crucify the messenger. That's what happens to Christ. They kill the messenger. How does this work for an individual? Well, Proverbs 18 verse 1 says this, a man who isolates himself seeks his own desire. He rages against all wise judgment, for a fool has no delight in understanding, only expressing his own heart. What this means is I get so addicted to my method of doing things that I exclude any voice from the outside. Any voice that would tell me, you're on the wrong track, buddy. What you're doing is going to hurt you and everybody around you. I'm going to kick that person out of my life, and I'm saying, no, I'm only going to heap up voices that agree with my system. Only the voices, only the experts that tell me I'm right, those are the only ones I'm going to listen to. Every expert that tells me I'm wrong, I'm going to exclude them from my consciousness because I cannot bear the idea that I'm on the wrong path and need to radically change my life. I don't want to hear that. See, the message that people are willing to listen to is slight adjustment. Right? So the politicians who are being raised up right now, they're the slight adjustment politicians. They're, hey, I know we're on a bad track, guys, but let's try to be a little bit more fiscally responsible, and I'm sure we're going to avoid the cliff. Those are the politicians who will win because nobody wants to hear the politician who says, the bridge is out ahead, guys. We have to seriously change everything we're doing. And we're all going to suffer as a result of my system. Everybody's going to hurt as a result of what I'm doing. Nobody wants to hear that. That's the voice of the outside, man. That's the dangerous voice. That's the voice that's preaching cataclysm. That's the voice that we have to kill because we don't want to harm the oil and wine. We don't want to change the way that things go. As I said, you have all these symbols that you don't know how to interpret, but you heap up your own experts that tell you what you want to hear. In 2 Timothy 4, Paul says that. In the latter days, times will come when men will no longer abide by the truth. But with itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers that will tickle their fancies and tell them what they want. This is exactly what we're being warned about. You may have the wisdom necessary to understand something is wrong in your life. Maybe you recognize that there's something wrong in your health. Maybe you recognize there's something wrong in your family, your marriage, your career. You sense something is wrong. But are you willing to listen to the voice that is outside? The voice that is telling you, you are so wrong that you need to radically change your life. You don't just need to try a little harder. You don't just need a little bit more discipline. Well, I'm going to cut out this one little thing and then everything's going to work out. No. You need to totally transform the way that you're behaving, because if you don't, you are headed for collapse. You are creating your own famine, and you will devour yourself. Now, Joseph gives this counsel, and this counsel is radical. Like I said, it's not small. It's not a tiny change. It's not a, hey guys, maybe try to save a little of the grain that you're harvesting. It's about a 20% tax that he implements on the people. That is massive. That is a massive tax that he puts on people. Because the change necessary to save the system is always going to be radical. It's always going to be radical. And if we're not the kind of people willing to make the necessary sacrifices to make things right, we will only heap up for ourselves teachers that are telling us what we want to hear, as opposed to people who are telling us what we need to hear, which might not tickle our fancies. Once you learn the discipline necessary to heed the outside voice, the voice that's telling you you need to make radical changes to your life, otherwise you're headed for collapse, otherwise you're headed for calamity. I'm glad you're in a season of prosperity right now, but you must learn the necessary lessons from this season. Otherwise, once the prosperity ends, you're going to devour yourself. The people that are telling you this are the ones that are friends. The people who are telling you what you want to hear are your enemies. Proverbs 27, verse 6. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. General rule of thumb. If your enemy wants you to do something, it's probably not good for you. Right now, again, politically, just ask yourself the question, what do our enemies want us to do? It's a pretty good indicator of what we shouldn't do. In the same way, there are things that your enemy wants you to do. There are things that Satan would want you to do, your adversary, the one who is opposed to you. And it's usually pretty obvious, the voice of Satan versus the voice of God. The voice of Satan is, again, it's the one that's tickling your fancy. It's the one that's feeding your narcissism, feeding the thing that you want, no matter the sacrifice. The voice of God is the one that's telling you the correct path. It's telling you not to make just any sacrifice, but the right one that will lead to betterment. This is very important. Bad counsel is more damaging than no counsel at all. We live in this weird time in history where people think, I could just go on an app and I could ask a random person for advice and it couldn't hurt me. Yes, it can. If they give you bad counsel and you follow it, it could radically alter your life for the worse. It could destroy you. The right counsel is the one that you need, and the right counsel are the faithful wounds that are given to you by a friend. The faithful wounds that are given to you by a friend. We live in this weird over-validating culture as well, where modern counsel is oriented at just validation of what people want, because we think that that's the greatest sin I could ever commit is offending you. When in reality, the greatest sin that I could probably commit is enabling you in something that will destroy you, but we don't tend to see things that way. The voice of the outside is the one that will tell you they will harm you, but they will harm you as a friend. They're the ones that care so much about you that they have to tell you what you don't want to hear. And this is the most insane thing about Joseph's story. Joseph could have very easily become Jonah. You know what I mean? The person who hates the system so much that he wants it to fail. What reason does Joseph have to care about Egypt? At every turn, they have ruined his life. They bought him as a slave. They falsely accused him of sexual sin. They threw him in prison, and they left him there for 2 years, even though he was the only one doing what was right. Once Pharaoh brought him out to be like, hey, tell us what to do about our society, if that was me, I'd be like, you figure it out. Look at what you've done to my life, man. I'm not going to tell you what to do. And by the way, he did it with no promise that he would be released from prison. Reading this story, you're like, Joseph, you're a terrible negotiator, man. Like, he gives them all the information without asking for a single promise, right? He's like, here you guys go. Here's how you save your society. If you want, I could go back to prison. That is a man of integrity. That is a man that is far more integrity than I have. Someone who cares enough about other people that he wants them to succeed even if it costs him his own happiness. That's why he's elevated over much. Faithful with a little, but elevated over much. To be the voice of the outside means that you care enough about other people to sometimes harm them. Some people, they're able to give the bad news, but they do it with like a weird glee. They like being the bearer of bad news. They're like, yeah, I like being right, so I'm going to tell you you're wrong, and I'm going to do it like a jerk. That's me, by the way. But it's very hard to care enough about someone. Like, there's some people who really struggle with that. They're like, I don't want to tell this person this bad thing because it breaks my heart. That's the right heart. But you need the courage to say it anyway, because faithful are the wounds of a friend. Right? You have to have the courage to say it. If you're like me, find the love to say it in mercy. But if you're afraid to say it, find the courage to say what you're afraid of. Because that's what's ultimately going to save them and you. The modern Christian can feel very helpless in a system of corruption. Right? So you're living in this system, and maybe, especially a lot of us after COVID, we look at our expert class and we're like, all of you are terrible. And I kind of hope that you get horrible diseases and die or something like that. You know, like we're like praying, cursing upon them because of how much they've harmed us. Jesus says in the last days, lawlessness will abound and the love of many will grow cold. The Christian is the person who does not give in to hate. Again, we will carry the voice of correction, but we will only be Christians if we do it in love. We will only be Christians if we carry the voice of correction because we care about the ones we are trying to correct. If you carry the voice of correction because you gleefully want to say, I told you so, when the rug gets pulled out, that's not exactly functioning in the spirit of Christ. That's not functioning in the spirit of Joseph. We're not supposed to want the collapse. We're supposed to want the repentance. And no one can tell you the impact of a single individual who simply lives their life in obedience to God. Yes, it's possible that Egypt would have never listened to Joseph. It happens to many prophets. Happens to Jeremiah. Happens at the end of Isaiah's life. It happened to Jesus. Many prophets are killed by their own people. But you never know the impact if you just simply focus on what God's called you to do and say, I will live a life of obedience to the calling of the Lord. There's always going to be eternal impact to the Christian who makes that decision, follows in the footsteps of Christ, and trusts the result to him. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 9, therefore, we make it our aim, whether present or absent, to be well-pleasing to him. Let's pray. Father, we love you and we're grateful for you. We thank you for a man like Joseph who lived so faithfully unto your word and faithful to the people around him. We pray that we would learn the lessons of Joseph's life. We would learn how to be people who follow truth, but we are people who hold that truth with mercy and kindness towards others. Help us, God, to yearn for the best, to yearn for your desires. Help us, Lord, to receive correction when it comes, to not resist it out of pride or resistance towards making correction or repenting in humility. But Lord, help us to heed the voice of counsel when it comes and to seek your face above all things. Through your Son we pray. Amen.